Imagine being chosen as a teenage girl, torn from your family without consent, sealed behind golden walls you will never leave. Your beauty becomes both your invitation and your sentence. Your future narrows to a single purpose, competing for the fleeting attention of one man, the Emperor of China. Welcome back to another eye-opening journey into history's darkest corners. Today we descend into the hidden, heartbreaking world of Chinese imperial concubines, the lives buried beneath the splendor of the Forbidden City. If you're drawn to the shadows of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories the past tried to erase. Deep within the Forbidden City, far from the public courtyards and ceremonial halls, existed an entirely separate world. Thousands of women lived sealed away from society. Most were palace maids and attendants. But a chosen few were selected for a far more dangerous role: imperial concubines whose sacred duty was to bear heirs for the emperor. These women did not wander freely. They were confined to the inner court, an isolated realm tucked deep within the northern heart of the palace. Every aspect of their existence was dictated by rigid hierarchy, relentless surveillance, and brutal competition. At the top stood the empress. Beneath her came imperial consorts, ranked concubines, and finally the vast army of female servants. This hierarchy was not symbolic. It governed what they wore, where they lived, how they spoke, and even how they breathed. The selection of concubines was not a romantic tradition. It was a merciless system refined over centuries. Its roots stretched back to the Jin dynasty, but by the Ming and Qing eras, it had become a carefully controlled machine of obedience and control. During the Ming dynasty, nearly every unmarried woman was legally required to participate in imperial selection unless she was already married or physically unfit. No family, no matter how poor or powerful, was exempt. Under the Qing dynasty, the process narrowed further. Only girls from Manchu and Mongol families within the 8-banner system were eligible. Han Chinese women were largely excluded, not for morality but for political control. The selection itself was cold and humiliating. Girls were escorted by officials to the Xinwu Gate of the Forbidden City, where they endured exhaustive inspections. Their skin, body hair, posture, scent, and behavior were scrutinized. Even their sleep was monitored. Candidates were required to share a bed with the emperor's mother so observers could determine whether they snored, moved too much, or emitted unpleasant odors during the night. One wrong movement, one careless breath, and your fate was sealed. Those who advanced were trained relentlessly. How to walk, how to sit, how to bow, how to speak without drawing attention. They studied poetry, calligraphy, music, and chess, not to thrive, but to survive in a palace where beauty could inspire favor or provoke death. Out of hundreds, only a few dozen survived the process. And of those, just 3 were elevated to the highest ranks. Many others would live out their lives inside the palace without ever once meeting the emperor they had been taken to serve. But selection was only the beginning. Inside the palace walls, the real danger began. Jealousy poisoned every corridor. Political maneuvering was constant. A concubine who gained the emperor's attention instantly became a target. Every step she took was watched, not only by rivals, but by the ever-present eunuchs who enforced imperial authority. Before a concubine could even approach the emperor's bedchamber, she was required to bathe, undergo medical inspection, and wait for formal summons. If chosen, her name was recorded in vermilion ink, a permanent, official record of the emperor's nightly activity. These encounters were not private moments. They were matters of state. The emperor might have possessed hundreds, even thousands, of concubines, yet many women spent decades confined to their chambers, passing time with embroidery, cosmetics, and quiet desperation, waiting for a summons that might never come. This system was rooted in Confucian ideals, where managing many wives symbolized masculine authority. For the emperor, concubinage was not indulgence, it was duty. Producing an heir was paramount. Polygamy was common among the elite, but only one woman held true authority, the empress. She was expected to suppress jealousy, enforce harmony, and maintain order. Love was irrelevant. Favoritism was dangerous. Emotion had no place in empire. Each dynasty refined its own hierarchy of ranks. Every woman's status determined her clothing, her residence, her servants, even how deeply she bowed. And beneath the rituals, the silks, and the hierarchy lay the truth. These women were prisoners. Most would never leave the Forbidden City. Many would die within its walls, erased from memory. The palace admired by the outside world was, for them, nothing more than a gilded cage. But the story grows even darker after the emperor's death. Concubines were not viewed as companions, they were considered the emperor's personal property in life and in death. Archaeological excavations of ancient imperial tombs have uncovered the remains of multiple women buried alongside a single ruler. These discoveries point to a chilling reality. Some concubines were sacrificed to accompany their lord into the afterlife. Practices varied between dynasties and even within them. If a concubine's son ascended the throne, she might remain in the palace with newfound power and influence. The empress usually remained as well. But for those who bore no children, mercy was rare. High-ranking consorts from noble families were sometimes allowed to return home, spending their remaining years in quiet isolation, alive but forgotten. Low-ranking concubines were not so fortunate. Most were confined to sealed quarters within the palace, cut off from the world, living out their days in silence, shadow, and waiting, until history quietly erased them. Some were sent away to Buddhist nunneries, stripped of their former identities and forced to abandon the lives they once knew. Their youth, beauty, and ambition were exchanged for shaved heads, prayer halls, and silent obedience. Others were assigned a far lonelier fate, ordered to guard the dead emperor's tomb. They lived in small, barren houses near the burial site, tending the grounds year after year, existing as permanent mourners for a man long gone. In earlier dynasties, particularly during the Chen and Jin periods, the outcome was even more brutal. Concubines who had not borne children were often executed after the emperor's death and buried alongside him as spiritual offerings, sacrificed to serve their ruler in the afterlife just as they had in life. There was, however, one astonishing exception. Wu Zetian entered the palace as a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. After his death, she was sent to a Buddhist nunnery as tradition demanded. But history had other plans. She began a relationship with Taizong's son, Li Ji, effectively her former stepson. When he ascended the throne, he summoned her back to the palace and elevated her to empress. Over time, Wu Zetian consolidated power, outmaneuvered rivals, and ultimately crowned herself emperor, the only woman in Chinese history to ever rule in her own name. Her rise shattered every rule imposed on women of her time. But she was a singular anomaly. For nearly all other concubines, life after the emperor's death remained bleak, silent, and unforgiving. During the Han dynasty, imperial sons were often sent to govern distant territories, and their mothers were permitted to accompany them. But concubines without children were left behind to tend imperial tombs, their lives reduced to ritual and isolation. In some cases, especially those noted for exceptional beauty, concubines from previous reigns were absorbed into the harems of newly crowned emperors, recycled into a system that never truly ended. The Song dynasty offered limited mercy. Some surviving concubines were granted honorary titles and allowed to remain in the palace for life. Others were condemned once again to tomb duty, or quietly compelled to take their own lives. Under the Yuan dynasty, women who had borne sons were treated with dignity and allowed to live comfortably. Those who had not often faced exile, disappearance, or lifelong silence. During the Qing dynasty, some concubines chose to end their own lives as demonstrations of loyalty to their deceased emperor. Others were given ceremonial titles and permitted to live out their remaining years in quiet confinement behind palace walls. Despite how modern films and dramas romanticize their lives, the reality was stark. Many concubines spent years, sometimes decades, without ever stepping into direct sunlight. Stories of secret affairs with palace guards or eunuchs do exist, but they were rare. The punishment was always death, and most women were unwilling to risk such a brutal end for a moment of freedom. Some, however, grew desperate. A few engaged in forbidden relationships solely to become pregnant, hoping to pass the child off as the emperor's and secure protection or status. In an age without DNA testing, deception was difficult to disprove, but the danger was immense. Abortion was forbidden. Once a pregnancy showed, there was no escape. A child conceived without imperial involvement meant certain execution. Leaving the palace was nearly impossible. Concubines could not send or receive letters. Even doctors were barred from examining them directly. Symptoms were written down and passed through intermediaries, with diagnoses and prescriptions issued at a distance. Escape was not part of the system. Some women did leave, but often as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, transferred from one gilded prison to another. A small number, after years of loyal service, were allowed to retire with modest pensions. In 1389, Emperor Hongwu decreed that after 5 years of palace service, a consort could retire and live as a common woman, marry, and start a family. Others chose religious life, becoming nuns. Some remained within palace institutions, working in places like the imperial laundry, still confined but no longer competing for survival. One of the most extraordinary and symbolic cases came at the very end of the system. Consort Wenxiu, concubine of China's last emperor, Puyi. After the emperor was expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, she lived with him and his wife in Tianjin. But in 1931 she did something no concubine before her had ever dared. She demanded a divorce. Puyi, though no longer emperor, issued a formal edict stripping her of her title and reducing her to commoner status. Wenxiu returned to Beijing, lived quietly as a primary school teacher, and died of illness in 1950. She never remarried. Her story marked the symbolic end of a system that had endured for centuries. And though hers was only one voice, it echoed with the strength of thousands of women who never had the chance to speak, whose lives were spent behind golden walls, remembered only as shadows in history's grandest palace.